Beyond simple nostalgia, we want to provide an understanding of how the sacrifices of a few determined individuals help to empower and inspire the generation of change agents we have gathered together for today's Leadership Legacy Summit. Today's discussion will explore the presence of museum activists who helped to shape the field as we know it. Their remarkable legacy will be shared through the lens of four dynamic leaders who I now get the privilege of introducing. And I would ask that the four panelists begin coming up to the stage and taking your seats. So Dr. John Fleming is the Museum Director in Residence at the National Museum of African American Music. He has directed major museums interpreting the experience of African Americans and is known throughout the country as a noted historian, author, academic, and museum expert. His professional experience includes museum directorships, management, and planning on historic preservation issues, appointments by governors and President George W. Bush. He has also had many and significant leadership roles in national and state museum associations, including AAAM. Next, I would like to introduce Fath Davis Ruffins. Fath Davis Ruffins is the curator of African American history and culture in the Division of Home and Community Life in the Smithsonian's National Museum of American History. She has been a historian and curator at the Smithsonian Institution since 1981. Between 1988 and 2005, she was the head of the Collection of Advertising History at the Archive Center. She is a specialist in ethnic imagery and immigration, the history of advertising, and on the social and cultural history of African Americans since 1900. Harry Robinson. Since 1974, Dr. Harry Robinson Jr. has served as president, CEO of the African American Museum, along with several administrative positions at Bishop College, which have included library director, Associate Dean of Academic Affairs, Special Assistant to the President, and Vice President for Development. As President CEO of the African American Museum, he completed a capital campaign to raise $6.8 million for the museum's new facility. Dr. Robinson. And now I have the privilege of welcoming and introducing our summit moderator, Ms. Juanita Moore, as we explore the presence, power, and persistence needed to advance the history and possibility of museum activists. Juanita is the president and CEO of the Charles H. Wright Museum of African American History. Moore led the teams that opened the National African American Museum and Cultural Center, the National Civil Rights Museum, and the American Jazz Museum. At the Wright Museum, she manages a $6.6 million budget and 52 full and part-time employees, along with 100 active volunteers. Since starting, she has been working on a sustainability plan and attracting more individual donors. At this point, I will turn it over to our moderator.
Good afternoon. It really is a pleasure for me to be here, and I am really, just really excited to be here with four of the field's most significant leaders and people who I admire and have always felt like I have had the opportunity to learn so much from. I will start with Fath. I used to always tell people Fath is the smartest woman I knew.
It's a joke.
It really wasn't. And I didn't say the smartest black woman that I knew, the smartest woman that I knew. So it is really a pleasure to have her here. And as I think about it, I was looking at the people that we have on stage. We have 4 museum directors and founders of museums. That's very exciting to have people on stage that's founded really, really interesting and exciting, and some of our most significant institutions. And I was thinking about Faith was not a founder or museum director, but she has been the person who has curated some of the most exciting exhibitions in our museums, African American museums, throughout for an extended period of time. So we're going to start with John Fleming, because when John and Harry came in, I said to both of them, "Hello, old men," because well, I'm right there with them, but so I felt I could say that to them. But along with that age comes a great deal of wisdom and knowledge. So I want to start by asking, talk about your first memory of being involved in the African American Museums Association and your work with African American museums.
I told Lonnie that I was going to get you back for that. When I entered the museum profession, Juanita had been at the Ohio Historical Society for maybe a dozen years. She taught me everything that I know about museums. My first experience with the association was in 1980, 81. I was trying to remember at that time, AAMA met with the AAM, and I think it was in Boston. That was my first conference, and I had been with the National African-American Museum, Afro-American Museum in Wilberforce for just under a year. And so I went to this conference. 6,000 white people were there, and I kept looking around for the African Americans, and one by one we sort of gravitated toward each other, and before the evening was over, all 19 of us were in one room. And I was shocked because at that time I was virtually attacked by Charles Wright of the Detroit Afro-American Museum for having the audacity to think that we could develop a national Afro-American museum at Wilberforce. And it was the general consensus of the membership that a museum of that stature should not be outside of Washington, and that it should be within the Smithsonian. And then there was this general notion within the association that there should not be one national African American museum that would take all of the federal money that they were getting. And I asked the question, how many of you are getting federal money? And no one was. But that sort of characterized my early involvement with the association. And it was John Kennard who made the statement that we do need a national museum, whether it's at Wilberforce or at the Smithsonian. He was at the Smithsonian. And slowly the museum membership came around to the idea that a national museum located in Washington was the right place, and the Smithsonian was the right institution to house the museum. And that I think Lonnie has convinced everyone since then that this museum was going to serve not only the nation, but our individual museums. And I think that this conference is an example of the partnership that can be developed when we all work together. So thank you, Lonnie, and thank you, Deborah.
Harry, what is your earliest memory of the association?
My earliest experience with the association was in 1977 when we were in the organizing stage with the grant from that National Museum Act, and the group met around the country. And one of the meetings was in Dallas, Texas, at the African American Museum. And at that meeting with John Kennard, Byron Rushing, Barry Gaither, and Dr. Wright couldn't make it, so he sent a delegation from Michigan, Miss Williamson and one or two others who came, and we met over the weekend. And that was one of several meetings that were being held around the country to get a feel about what the African American Museum Association ought to look like, who should be involved, and what we should be doing. And from there, Barry got together, as the documents say, and Barry was one of the leading forces in forming the African American Museum Association. There was a young woman named Deborah Spencer, who was recently out of Harvard, and she worked as the secretary, and Barry was the first president to work with
Was
the
Margaret Burroughs at
association.
that meeting?
I'm sorry?
Was Margaret Burroughs at that meeting?
Margaret wasn't at the meeting, and there was no one from Chicago at that meeting.
So talk a little bit about the sessions that went around the country. I know there was
Well,
one in
I
Atlanta.
just went to one of them, but we learned a lot from those sessions, not only that session, but there were several other sessions where we met, not necessarily one of those 4 or 5 sessions that was funded by the Museum Association. And there were certain things we learned from Margaret and Dr. Wright. You know, they were buddies of Paul Robeson and some other radicals, and they were instilling that stuff in us. And some of the things we remembered was that, and we believed them, some of the stuff they were telling us was that, one, these African American museums should be centers of liberation. They should be centers of education. And they were telling us that, look, you don't need to be another Dallas Museum of Art. First place, you know, you can't compete with them. And we sort of picked that up. And John Kennard, as you know, was the first director of the Anacostia Museum. And I guess it was one of the first museums that had a non-traditional program. John talked to the people. He went through Anacostia talking to people about what was on their mind. And the people told him rats and roaches. And as a result, John got the team together at Smithsonian and put together an exhibition on that crisis or that problem. And one of the stories they usually tell about that exhibition is that the kids went over to the museum. It was in a theater, I think, on what is now Martin Luther King. And now this is what I was told, could be legend, could be fact, that there was some museum rats from the Smithsonian. So the kids saw those rats in the little cage, and they wanted to bring their pet rats to the exhibition. Said, no, you can't mix lab rat with street rats. So they wouldn't let them bring the rats in. So while the museum folks were not looking, the kids came in and brought the street rats and put them in the cage, and they wiped out the Smithsonian rats. That's the street story. But John Kennard talked to the people, and that's one thing they instilled in us. Always connect with the people. And I remember at John Kennard's funeral, you know, those of us who were close to him were weeping and mourning and crying. And I saw some people who looked like they were homeless people. And they were standing up talking about Mr. Kennard and what he had done with that museum and how that museum had transformed them. And that's what we were all about. And that's what I hope we will continue to be about.
Faith, I remember as you were a young woman, really young woman that really was always at the association meeting taking notes and minutes and really keeping the records and planning meetings and just really working very hard. So talk to us a bit about what you remember and your work with the association.
Well, I first got involved with the association when I first came to the Smithsonian, which was in January of 1981. And Joy Ford Austin, who was the first director of the association, came to my office and said, oh, there's an association of African American museums. I said, really? Well, I need to join that. So I did. And I got involved. And those of you who are in my age group will probably remember that in the bad old, good old days, women often were the secretaries of organizations. They couldn't be the president, but they could be the secretary. So I was the secretary of AAMA for a number of years. And so I was always taking notes. I probably still have those notes. But what it did, meeting these people whose names are being thrown around now, like John Kennard and Margaret Burroughs and Charles Wright and others who we may also name, was astonishing, because each of these people were really powerful, often eccentric, extremely dynamic and distinctive characters. They weren't, these were people who had founded museums who had never worked in a museum. And so they had very powerful ideas about the relationship that museums should have to communities, which Harry has talked about. And the notion, most of these people had come out of the modern civil rights movement, and they were taking these ideas of community and personal empowerment and cultural democracy and cultural activism, and using the museums as the method to further these ends in their communities. But they were also, many of them were very kind of funny and quirky, and they were characters. And I was very interested, I've always been interested in history and literature. I was very interested in them as characters. And this has led this led essentially directly to my work, to my written work, which is I was interested in understanding, as a cultural historian, I was interested in understanding how the tenets of the modern civil rights movement were being utilized by these people in a new form after what we think of as the dynamic of the movement had somewhat ebbed. What were the people who were engaged in this? What did they do next? And for many of these people, Bernice Johnson Reagan, James Early at the Smithsonian, for many of these people, this is what they did next. And so I have been not a director, thank goodness. I have been I would call myself a participant observer. I'm really an ethnographer of the museum world and of the history of African Americans in preservation. So I remember many of these people in their power and glory, but also in their quirky funniness, their humor, the stuff of their personalities. And my own work has been informed by that and will continue to be so.
You're absolutely right. I remember Rowena used to always say, you can't out-white white people. So, and Lonnie, you had the opportunity to work with many of these people, and all of them, and especially out in California, a name we have not mentioned yet, Aurelia Brooks. So talk a bit about your work and with the African American Museums Association and your work out in California.
For me, the African American Museum Association in those days was really my graduate school. That basically, I remember going to my first meeting, and I had known John Kennard because I'd been at the Smithsonian, and John basically said, "Come here, boy." That's what he said, "Come here, boy, I want to show you something." And he brought me over to see Rowena and Charles Wright, and he said, "This is a green kid, make him better." And so they started to tell me about what their expectations were, that museums would make America better, that museums would be brave and not cowardly, that you would confront evil wherever, and that you would bring the highest standard of quality in education you could. So I was taking notes and feeling pretty good about this when Margaret Burroughs walked in, and she said to me, "I don't know who you are, so come sit down and talk to me." And she basically gave me a test. She asked me all these questions. I didn't have the answers. And I'll never forget, she said to me, "When I see you at the next meeting, you better be better." I've never forgotten that, so I try to get better every meeting. But the reality is they were unbelievably powerful personalities, and one of the things as a young museum person was watching the tensions play out within the group, because there were amazing fights. A lot of times it broke down on gender lines. Candidly, it was the guys versus, keeping the women under control kind of thing. And so there were all these battles. But what I realized is those weren't personality battles. They were battles about what's the best method to make these museums sustainable, successful, and to do the work that needed to be done. These were battles not about, I'm more important than you. They were battles about urgency, recognizing that these museums had a vital role to play and what was the best way to do it. So for me, even though I remember standing back and watching the battles, I learned so much that it's okay to have passion, because the passion is taking us to the promised land.
And I think the battles there were a lot of them along gender lines, and we had Harriet Tubman, Sojourner Truth, Rowena Stewart, and Margaret Burroughs, Mary Smith Campbell, people who were very, very vocal and had
Joan
very
Maynard.
Joan Maynard was a peacemaker.
I was going to say, she was the one that crowded
She wasn't
the line.
Harriet Tubman.
She was a mediator.
She was the mediator.
She was a mediator.
So, and now that you bring her up, talk a little bit about Joan Maynard and what she really meant to the association, because she was always there, never ever missing.
Never missing. Joan Maynard, of course, was the founder of the Weeksville Museum and Heritage Society in Brooklyn, and she was an artist and a museum founder who had moved. Many of these museums were new constructions, but she was one of the ones who was involved in preservation. And she had, not by herself, but she had really uncovered the idea that these houses in Weeksville, these houses in Brooklyn, were historic and had an African-American connection. And she really saved them. She and the group of people that she brought together from her community really saved them. And I always thought of Joan, who had a soft voice and was a quieter person, though still a very powerful personality. I always thought that she had learned her mediation skills in the rough and tumble of the politics of New York, which, let me tell you, after spending nearly 20 years as a consultant to the African burial ground, I can tell you is no joke, okay? You are really dealing with people who are very, very serious about what they believe in, and there are conflicts among them, as there are in all communities. But Joan had a kind of quiet way of saying, well, you said this and you said that, and can't we find some common ground here? And she really was an extraordinarily deft. She showed, my mother used to say that you can be very powerful and you can still be a lady. So you can tell she's in a different generation. But Joan was that. She really kind of embodied that. And that quality I always appreciated.
Harry, talk a bit about, I know you already had a very strong and lucrative career before you moved into the whole museum setting. But the African American Museums Association, I think, must have informed how you went about your introduction and work in the field of museums. So talk a bit about that, how the association did that.
I was, well, I hadn't planned to go to college in the first place. I was going to the Air Force. I was going to get my education in the Air Force, but I had health issues. So I decided to go to college and was going to be an industrial arts teacher because my role model back home was industrial arts. Well, I had health issues, so I decided to go into history. And got to my junior year, and some of my mentors, we didn't call them that at the time, said, what are you going to do with a bachelor's in history? Are you going to graduate school? I hadn't thought of all of that. They said, what you need to do is to get some kind of insurance. So I decided to get a teaching certificate. So I went through the teacher education program, and while I was there, was an interesting thing. I went to an HBCU, and when we were at those HBCUs, we didn't have a lot of African American or Negro studies because they were trying to make us middle class. And here I was at Southern University, the largest institution for African Americans in the country. I was a history major, was not required to take history, African American history. But there was a woman in the School of Education whose name was Dr. Davidson, who had graduated from Harvard and then went to Columbia. And she required all education people getting certificates to take a course in Negro history. And I got the bug about this history stuff. In addition to having worked with an old guy on the campus who was the dean of the university, his name was John Brother Cade, and he would take me up to the campus, take me up to the oldest house on the campus, which was the University Archives. I had no idea what archives were. All I knew was I was with this old man on Saturday afternoon going through all of these records on Louisiana history. And this stuff continued to build, and in the meantime, I was a student in the university library because I worked in the library for 4 years. So I decided this stuff is pretty good. I'm going to stick with it. So I decided to go to graduate school at Atlanta University. And boy, that was like throwing a rabbit in a briar patch because of the deep, deep, rich history of African American studies and collections. So I was able to work in special collections with a woman named Dr. Annette Hoyt Fennessy, who was a terrorist. She really was. She was my cataloging teacher, and she took no prisoners. And she took me under her wings, and I was able to work. And this stuff continued. And as I went through graduate school, I continued to build on this. And then going to Alabama State, working in the library as Dean of Learning Resources, I was responsible for archives, special collections, and the whole 9 yards. And guess who I met at Alabama State? Dr. Charles Wright. Dr. Wright was a graduate of Alabama State, and he was there for homecoming. And I had succeeded a woman who had been at that school for 40-some years, and I had learned, being an old Baptist, that if you go behind a preacher or somebody 40 years, you lift up their names over and over and over. So what I did was name a special collection for Miss Eiley Brown. That university had one of the strongest collection of African American books. Phyllis Wheatley's poems, Langston Hughes' works, and it just continued from one thing to the other. And then when I ended up in Dallas, I went there with the idea of, working with this museum because I had sort of semi-museum experience at Alabama State and at Atlanta University. And when I got back to Texas, because I had worked in Texas before, got back to Texas, the president was an old Renaissance man, Morehouse man, math major, French major, but he had an appreciation for African American culture, and he saw what I had done previously. And when I went back to sign the contract, he called me and asked me, he said, "What do you want to do?" He said, "Because I feel that we need to give more back to this community. The college has gotten more from the community." So I told him what I wanted to do with the museum and the library. And that's how we got started and went to full bloom. And he supported us, and people from the community supported us. But when I went to Texas, I started this African American Museum, but there was something there before I got there. In 1936, when Texas was celebrating its centennial, they built Fair Park, bunches of buildings, Museum of Fine Arts, Natural History, Science Museum, Arboretum, everything you can name. And there was a guy named A. Maceo Smith who challenged the city fathers. He said, "Look, you don't have any Negro presence in this park," even though they were building buildings with federal money, state money. And they said, "Well, if you can raise the money, we'll build a building." So he decided to go to the state legislature, ask for money. They were about to give it to him, but there was another brother in town who decided he's going to run for state legislature. And so the fathers went to him and said, "Look, if you pull out, we'll give Maceo the money." He said, "No." Maceo, pull him out, get the money. "No, money's off the table." So guess what Maceo did? He pulled together a committee with Frederick Patterson, who was president of Tuskegee, founded United Negro College Fund, Sadie Alexander from Philadelphia, Henry O. Tanner's niece, Jones from the Commerce Department. Long story short, he got $100,000 for that museum, 50 for the building and 50 for collection. And immediately after the fair, the building was torn down. So from 1936 until the time we got there, there was nothing. So I always like to tell people that even though people credit me for founding a museum in Dallas, but the seeds had been planted, and someone had been there before I got there. It was A. Maceo Smith, and it was on that we built and continue to build the African American Museum in Dallas.
I think it's really important to, follow up on what Harry just said, which is we are rightly celebrating some of the founders of the African American Museum Association, but the preservation of African American materials by African American peoples goes well back into the 19th century. So each of these people were preceded by several previous generations of people who were preserving things, and sometimes personal collections, sometimes collections that ended up at, for example, Moreland Spin Garden at Howard or the Schomburg Center in New York. But I think it's important to note that this association and the collections that we all represent are really standing on the work of more than close, not quite, but close to 2 centuries of previous work.
Absolutely. John, you've talked about the fact that in your, for your first connection to the African American Museums Association, there was some resistance about building a museum in Wilberforce. But even once you got past that, the people in the association, like the Rowena Stewarts, the John Kennards, and Barry Gaither, and Byron Rushton, all those people, talk a bit about their influence in helping you shape your vision about your career in museums.
Well, like Lonnie, I needed a lot of help. I worked for the Institute for the Study of Educational Policy at Howard, and one evening we were at the Embassy Row Hotel, and Lionel Newsom, president of Central State University, said, how would you like to start a museum? We're planning a state partnership with the federal government on a new museum that the Ohio Historical Society has undertaken. So being a historian and never having any experience working in the museum, I said, yeah, I'd like to do that. I always say, only a historian would say something like that. So I was invited out to Columbus to the Ohio Historical Society and interviewed by members of the legislature and the staff of the society. At the end of the day, they offered me the job. The only question they asked me is, do you go to museums, and what museums do you like? And at that time, I was living in Washington, so I said, naturally, the Smithsonian, the American History, the Natural History Museum. So I got the job, and I would say one thing about the early founders of museums, we talked with each other all the time. And I have to tell this story about Aurelia Brooks. She was developing the California Afro-American Museum at the same time that I was working on the Wilberforce project, and she would call me religiously each week at 5 o'clock, which was, 2 o'clock California time. So she had 3 more hours on the clock, and I was working overtime. But we shared ideas. We talked about collections, and another person that I talked with quite a bit was Spencer Crew, who was developing Field to Factory, and we were out collecting at the same time. Rowena was particularly helpful in terms of being able to call her, and Barry Gaither, other people in the field. We talked about creating workshops that would be sponsored by the association in order to provide staff development for our folks. And we often were figuring out how to solve a problem, how to do something, and and then we went about teaching others how to do it. So there was a lot of camaraderie. I remember once Raina said that when we started, and the Park Service, for example, National Park Service, had very little interest in African American history or historic sites, we were teaching them. And then she said, we've come a long way because now they're holding workshops and conferences dealing with African American history and the sites that were added during the 80s and the 90s. So I would say that the positive thing about having a small number of museums, having a small number of museum directors and staff, is that we felt like we needed each other, we could help each other. And while we went to the major museums associations, state local history, AAM, we felt like we were coming home when we came back to AAMA, and it was a nourishing experience, and I felt that way for the last 37 years.
Faith says something about our founders, the other guys that were here, Margaret, Charles, Wright, John Kennard. You know, we talk about those people, we talk about museums, but those people were really not about museums. They were just using museums as tools to empower the community, to educate the community. Look, I can always remember they told us there should be centers of liberation. And Bishop Stokes, who was from Wilberforce, reminded me when he was the presiding bishop or the resident bishop in Dallas, Texas, he and his wife would come and visit. And they kept reminding, he said, now Robinson, these need to be centers of liberation, of empowering our people. And he talked about transforming, they got to be transformation center. And they felt that if we serve as transformation center, when people came in, you gave them new information, new ideas, and it resulted in new behavior, which meant people felt better about themselves. When the kids came to the African American Museum and saw certain things in education program, and by the way, when we were coming along, you did not find, we can take credit, African American museums, for these outstanding education and outreach programs that these major institutions have now. We did it out of necessity. We didn't have anything else. We didn't have collections. So we relied on programming because we didn't have collection. And now the larger museums picked up our models and they're getting all of the money for ideas that we started of keeping the museum open. Where would you go to a major museum and it was open other than from 10 to 5, you know, Tuesday through Sunday and closed on Mondays? But at the African American Museum, they were community centers, they were liberation centers, they were education centers, and later on some of them became art centers. But there was a special message and there was a special mission for these institutions, and I hope we will never forget it. But they were talking about empowering the people, liberating the people, and that's what the African American Museum movement was about.
That's very true, and everybody should clap for that because that really should continue to be. That's an important point. That's a very important point. I'm going to do something now. I'm going to call out a name. These are all deceased people, so you know. I'm going to call their name, and I want you to give me the first word that comes to your mind about this person. And Lonnie's looking at me, and I'm going to start with him.
Okay.
Okay. Margaret Burroughs.
Brilliantly feisty.
Well, you have to come up with another one because you're next. Same person, Margaret Burroughs. John?
Independent.
Foxy.
I would say imperious. Margaret was a queen. She was a diva. And you knew that the minute you met her. She was always very elaborately dressed. And she had this regal manner as if she were granting you an audience.
John Kennard. We'll start with Faith. John Kennard.
He was lion-like,
Yeah.
leonine. He was the lion of Anacostia.
John was a very resourceful person. He believed in share, and Lonnie talked about how those more experienced museum persons took us under their wing. For about 13 years, John Kennard called me every Friday at the end of business day to talk about something that we were doing. And if he didn't get me that afternoon, he would call me about 10:30 at night on a Friday night. Harry, what you doing, little so-and-so? At 10:30 at night. I said, John, if I were not talking to you, I'd be asleep somewhere. What are you doing? And he was either baking bread or cooking for Margie Kennard. But he was always a resource for John. I need such a thing. Harry, I don't know about that. But he knew somebody else who did. And he was very resourceful, and he didn't mind using his resources to help those of us who were coming along.
John Kennard. John.
A fighter. I think that John was at the Smithsonian when not everyone believed in African American history and culture, so that everything that he achieved at the Anacostia Museum, he had to fight for.
And I would call John a teacher, because John is one of the most important people in my career. When I came to the Smithsonian in 1978, John Kennard called me my second day of work, and he said, come on over, we need to talk. Boy. So I went over to the theater, which was the Anacostia Museum, and I thought we were going to talk about, I don't know anything about museums, but we were going to talk about museums. And he said to me, boy, the first thing you need to learn is I'm going to help you figure out how to be black at the Smithsonian. And I'm like, I've been black my whole life, man. I don't need to. And he gave me this course about how do you handle the politics of the Smithsonian? How do you deal with the Smithsonian's prejudices about race and the bigotries that were inherent in the place? And John would, almost every month, he would summon me to come over and teach me more about how to survive at the Smithsonian. And I remember thinking that this guy was the best teacher I knew, because he was brilliant, practical, strategic, and tactical.
Rowena Stewart, and I'm going to start with John Fleming.
Has someone already used the term feisty? Rowena Stewart came from Jacksonville, Florida, during the Civil Rights era, went to Rhode Island and started the Rhode Island
Heritage
Society, Black
Black
Heritage
Heritage
Society,
Society.
and went to Philadelphia. She fought for everything that she was able to achieve against odds, and Faith talked about the prejudice against females, and she sincerely believed in everything that she was doing. In fact, I'm going to tell this little story. I think it was when Spencer was working on Field the Factory, and she heard that Spencer, she thought someone told her that Spencer had taken a stoop from one of the row houses, and she called him up and said, why are you invading my territory, taking my objects? Well, it turned out not to be true, but she was truly dedicated to her projects, no matter what they were.
Harry, Rowena Stewart.
When I think of Rowena, I think of Mary McLeod Bethune.
Faith.
Rowena was like a force of nature. And she started as a social worker. And I think that's really interesting. Some of these other people, Wright was a doctor, Kennard was a minister. She was a social worker. And I did a long series of interviews with her. And she basically said that she'd spent 10 or 15 years working as a social worker, kind of helping people clean up their problems and trying to make life better. And she decided that she wanted to start at the other end. She wanted to start with empowering people and helping them before it got so bad that they had to rely on a social worker. So she was really a person who had a powerful personal desire to like save people. And that came through the fierceness of her commitment to that was very evident.
Lonnie?
In some ways, to me, Rowena is a visionary because, and in some ways, I don't even know how to say it, but I'm old enough to have read stories about Johnny Appleseed, this guy that went around the country and planted apple trees. Well, she was a female version of Johnny Appleseed. Everywhere she went, museums that wrestled with African-American culture sprang up, and they sprang up strong and beautiful. So I think that Rhode Island would never be where it is without Rowena. The museum in Philadelphia, I think her work in Kansas City. So in some
Motown.
ways, Motown, in some ways, Rowena more than anyone else, because most of us stayed. Right. She went and she planted that seed everywhere, and we have been made better by Rowena Stewart.
Joan Maynard, and we're going to go really one word because I got one last question, and I want to run out of time for that one. Joan Maynard?
Well, I said she's a peacemaker.
Yes.
Ditto.
A friend.
Yes.
She was fine.
My last question, given all that you know about the African American Museums Association and your work in it and your work in museums, what would be the one lesson that you think that museum leaders and folks in museums today should take from the African American Museums Association and the work in it?
Well, you know, I would argue that what I learned was what leadership really is. We can talk about the personalities, the fighting, but what the association taught me is that leadership really is about defining reality and giving hope. And in a way, what this institution did was helped us go from a dream to a reality. So that notion of being smart enough to define reality, but passionate enough to give hope, is what I learned from this organization.
John?
I want to say something about what happened to the association in 1989, 1990.
I didn't do it. I did.
And it all has to do with what we value in terms of our institutions. We saw what happened when we integrated the schools and losing control of our schools, especially in the South and all. So we had this African American Museums Association that really benefited our community. And sometime during the 1989, the association lost its funding. It lost its executive director. It was on the verge of going out of existence. Gary Puckrin was the president, head of American Vision magazine. And the next year, I think it was 1990, the association was due to go to Dallas, and Harry was hosting the meeting. 91. And Harry had made all of the arrangements, had secured $15,000 to support the organization meeting. And Gary wanted to get Colin Powell to do a fundraiser for the organization. And he wanted to take the association from Dallas and bring it back to Washington. And I said no, and some of us others said no, because it was going to Dallas, and Harry had planned the meeting for over a year. Well, we lost the executive director. Gary resigned as president. So we went to Dallas with no leadership, no president, no money, and those people that we've been talking about this afternoon came together to talk about what are we going to do, how are we going to save this association. And we spent hours. We started in the morning talking, we worked into the evening, and we were trying to come up with a solution. And about 2 o'clock that morning, I said, well, I've had enough. I'll see you at 6. I'm going to bed. I came back to the meeting at 6 o'clock, and they said, Congratulations, Mr. President.
That's it.
And we
And let me be honest, I voted twice for him. So.
But we moved the offices to Wilberforce for 7 or 8 years, and we began the process of rebuilding. We worked with Harry, we worked with Lawrence Peugeot at Birmingham, and other directors and other institutions, and we finally got the association back to where we thought it could be. And I think that now that the National Museum is open and the association is being housed there, that it is going to live well into the future, and it's going to be a stronger organization for not only the dedication of the early founders, but all of you who are here as a testament to the value of the association.
Harry?
You know, when I was a younger man, I would see old men cry. I didn't understand that then. But as I sit here today and think of how we got started and look at all of the young professionals, African-American professionals, I understand now why those old men were crying. Now, John Fleming talked a lot about the conversation and all the talking was going on about AAM. But John Fleming single-handedly saved the African American Museum Association.
No one does it by themselves.
Now, he doesn't tell that, but I know I was there because I escaped. It was right after my term. But John was there. We had all kinds of problems, serious kinds of problems that would send you to jail. But John Fleming was there, and he worked through it, and I am grateful for what John did for the association. John, thank you, and look at us now.
Faith? There's one lesson that you think that folks should learn, people can learn from the association in this work.
Well, having heard what you all have just heard, all of which is true and more too, I would say that truth-telling is one of the most important aspects of being in this business. And so you have heard some truth to be told, and all I can do is just echo the feeling that it's astonishing to me to see all of these young people and to see you here, and thank you.
John and Lonnie touched upon, look, we doing all of this polished stuff, the polite stuff, but that will always knock down, drag out fights about having the National Museum established, because a lot of people are afraid that establishing this museum was going to drain resources from us, which was not true. But John Kennard kept us focused, and he said, we gotta have, we should have, we must have, we ought to have a National Museum. And he said, and here's what we need to do. It needs to be a resource for us. It needs to be for training. And I want to thank Debbie and Lonnie for living up to that dream. The National Museum of African American History and Culture it hasn't been up but a year or so, not a year, but it has been very resourceful. And I want to tell you, I'm an old man now, and I've seen a lot, but I have never seen as much enthusiasm in my community and in the African American community about African American Museum and African American culture as I have about the National Museum on the Mall. It has benefited all of us. We have really all benefited from the new museum on the Mall, and we're grateful for that.
Please join me in thanking Lonnie Bunch, John Fleming, Harry Robinson, and Fath Davis Ruffins. And thank you